Hi guys, this is Sentence7 for headsupsng.com, and this is my second free video, Irish Poker and Introduction. So for those who don't know, Irish Poker is Full Tilt's newest game format. The action's been okay so far, not too active, but enough that there's generally a couple of games running around the clock, be they 6 max cash, heads up cash, turbo sit and goes, heads up hyper sit and goes, and a bunch of MTTs. So if you're looking to get your feet wet and learn a new game, there's definitely a bunch of formats to choose from. But before we begin, I should note actually that I had exactly 0 Irish poker experience before I started collecting hands for this video, so it should definitely not be viewed as kind of an all-inclusive Irish poker strategy guide per se, but rather as an exercise in adapting the skills we've developed in other game formats and applying them to situations we may not be completely familiar or even comfortable with just yet. So that's my little disclaimer, but having said that, let's take a look at some of the basics. So firstly, let's take a look at the format of Irish Poker, and that is as follows. Each player is dealt 4 cards pre-flop, then we get a betting round, we see the flop followed by another betting round, at which point each player discards 2 of their cards, and the remainder of the hand plays out in regular no-limit hold'em fashion. So basically the big question with Irish Poker for new players is hand selection. From what I've observed at all the lower stake games and even some of the mid-stake games is that people are generally treating this as an Omaha game pre-flop, which based on some of the talks amongst the higher stake guys on 2+2 and some regs who have more experience with the game, that could be a pretty big mistake. It appears that people are generally overvaluing their runs, so hands like 5, 6, 7, 8 and such. Because in reality, although we do get 4 cards, it's going to be much more difficult to make a strong hand with those since we need to dump 2 of our cards halfway through the hand. So in PLO, the reason those types of cards are so powerful, the rundown cards, is that we can flop like a whole bunch of draws whose equity when totaled together will allow us to play our hands quite aggressively without too much concern of being crushed by our opponent's hand or range. Or so we would hope, I guess. But in Irish, it turns out that what these types of hands actually lead to is just a bunch of weaker hands like naked open-enders, pair and gut shots, bottom 2 pair, and basically just a wide variety of low equity hands that are going to make our lives extremely difficult as we proceed to the turn and river. So for this reason, it appears that our hand selection should be weighed more towards no-limit hold'em type hands that work well together. So like 2 pairs is obviously a super strong hand, as well as suited ace with a couple of connecting cards, 4 face cards, a pair with a couple of decent side cards that either connect to the pair like 10, 10, 9, jack, or even with side cards that don't connect to it but work well on their own. Like for example, Queen, Queen, 7, 6 suited. But yeah, so unlike PLO, we shouldn't be looking to get it in with our draws too often, since usually, well, especially at the lower stakes, if a lot of money's going in the pot, people are going to generally be pretty nutted. Of course, this is going to be much more applicable in deep stack cash or tournament play than heads up hypers, but I thought it was important to cover anyways, especially for those of you who are looking to get into this format or into this game, but not necessarily the heads up hyper format. Which leads us to our next point, which is opponent tendencies. So again, from what I've seen so far, it appears most of our weaker low to mid-stake opponents are going to be extremely loose pre-flop, much as they are in PLO, but then inevitably turn into what I call a now what player when they realize they have to discard a bunch of their equity and are not even close to nutted and are just unsure how to proceed. So in these situations, of which there's going to be way more than you can even imagine, even within just one heads up sit and go, it's going to be extremely profitable for us to continuously take aggressive lines and put our opponents to an endless string of tough decisions. Inevitably, this is going to lead to one of 3 things, I think. Your opponent is either going to quit, if it's a game format where they can, like a cash game. Your opponent will spaz out and spew, which we always love. Or the most profitable one, your opponent is just going to become kind of enveloped in fear and basically let you run over them. So that brings us to the final point I want to discuss on the slide here, which is the 3 best ways to really abuse timid or scared opponents. And those are floats, c-bets, and check raises. I don't want to spend too much time discussing these individually right now, as we'll review them in our hand history shortly, but the obvious important idea is to never stop applying pressure on your opponent and just continuously force them to get into situations where they're not comfortable and where they're not really sure what the most profitable play is. So let's take a look at some of the ways we can do this. Alright, so before we get started with this hand history, one quick tip that I'd like to point out that I kind of noticed fairly quickly once I started playing these games is that for an observant opponent, something that's going to be extremely profitable is to watch the speed at which people dump their cards after the flop betting round. I personally try to select the cards I'm dumping before I either call my opponent's bet or make my own c-bet so as not to give up my timing tells. But many of my opponents, in fact pretty much all of them, will in certain situations will often like c-bet blindly, and once they see you call, will have to make a decision about whether to dump a made hand in favor of a draw or try to decide between two different draws that might be rather close from an equity standpoint, or at least appear to be to an inexperienced player. So for this reason, my immediate assumption is anytime my opponent takes a while to discard, is that it is most likely a good spot for me to turn up my aggression. So remember to keep an eye on that, both for yourself and your opponent. Alright, but getting back to the hand here, so up first we have King 10, 4-8 double suited, which is going to be more than good enough, obviously, to open in a heads-up hyper Irish game, or really any Irish game, I'd suspect. I think we can expect to get flatted here by a much wider range than we would in a regular hyper game, just because of pre-flop play tendencies that we spoke about. But as we said, we can do a lot of fun things post-flop, even with a relatively short stack of 25 big blinds. So we go ahead and open here, and this is one of those pretty easy and sexy situations where we effectively flop the nuts. But I think the important thing to take away from this hand is that there's really not much value in raising when our opponent donk bets, as he does right here. We should just let him continue barreling and make it look as if we have some kind of draw or weaker hand that can't stand much heat. So we go ahead and make the call. When the villain pots it, as he does here on turn, when villain pots it, I'm pretty comfortable that he would rarely, if ever, do this with a boat, as I believe he would generally go for a smaller value bet and not risk scaring us off our weak hand, or what he might perceive to be our weak hand. I think even the nut flush is relatively unlikely to play in this manner, so I put villain's range at lower flushes, queen X's, ace of spades plus pair like ace 9, and maybe a couple spazzes with like jack 10 or something like that, or just the naked ace of spades. So against that range, I think the best play, once he pots it, is to abandon our slow play and shove it here and force him to call off all his made hands plus big draws, specifically the ace of spades. We really want him, if he has that card, to really get it in here. We don't want to give him an opportunity to see a bad river and find a fold for his remaining half stack. So he pots, and I just decide to just shove it in here. Results not very important, but for future reads, he was leading here with the flush, which is not a bad play at all. I don't mind his play here, though I'm unlikely to have potted the turn as he did. Okay, up next we have a hand where there's an example of where I made at least one mistake and most likely two. So if you notice, we're quite short stack effectively. He's at about 7 big blinds. We have kings with the jack 5, definitely a strong enough hand to get it in this short stack. I think the mistake, at least the first mistake I made was min raising. I think for at this stack depth, I think our opponent is going to call off a ridiculously wide range, so I think there's really no point in min raising. It might even look stronger to min raise here than to just open jam. I think we can definitely get called by a whole lot worse in the spot, so I think there's no real reason to be tricky or slow play or whatever I thought I was doing here. I think the best play is just going to be to just jam and let our opponent just call it off, which I expect him to do, as I said, extremely wide. So having said that, we min raise, our opponent calls, which is not really the best play on his part. He really should be just at this point kind of folding or getting it in. Flop. So on this flop, I see I'd expect some people to get worried and possibly check back here, assuming an ace is a really big part of his range. But in actuality, I really don't think it is. I think with his stack depth, I think he 3-bet shoves almost all his aces. Definitely anything, if he has like anything remotely resembling a nice side cards to go along with it. So when he flats, I'm taking a bunch of ace X out of his range, and if that's the case, then I think we have the best hand here a big percentage of the time. So my second mistake I think I made here was when he checked, I just decided to shove it in. With my line of reasoning, I thought since I'm not this was clearly a value bet, I thought, but I just really wanted to make sure he put all his chips in here with kind of his flush draws, probably with his jack X's, maybe some of his straight draws, but I think that was a little bit ambitious here. I think we can definitely just make kind of a standard C bet here. I probably just kind of tilted because I realized I should have shoved pre-flop and just decided to shove it in, which is compounding mistakes, which is basically the worst thing you can do in poker, is to make one mistake and then make another one to try and offset that first one. So make sure not to be doing that too often. So I think if we make just a standard C bet here to 60, I think he gets in with a lot wider range than versus shove. Like he might spaz out with like a queen 10 or something like that, or 4x that he might not have called off versus shove. But having said that, we went ahead and shoved and got called by kind of the range, somewhere in the range that we were expecting him to be at. So yeah, definitely remember to shove your value hands when you're relatively short stack, and c-bet kind of normally, unless there's a real good reason, really good reason to do otherwise, which I don't think there was in this situation. Alright, up next we have a 9-Jack 4-4. Not the strongest hands by any means, but definitely good enough to open, especially versus a passive opponent, which most of our opponents are going to be at this level. By the way, I think this is like $10 sit and goes. So we go ahead and open. When our opponent min 3-bets, I just find it hard to put a very or a lot of value in that range. I just don't think he does this in this game format where there's going to be we're going to have a ton of equity in a lot of different spots. I don't think he does this for strong value with his like ace or anything of that sort. I expect this to be more like kind of suited connectors, rundowns, maybe a bunch of Broadway cards, couple of small pairs, something like that. I think he's just trying to take control here because I'd been running over him a little bit, so I think he's just trying to take some control. But regardless of his hand combination, against him in 3-bet, I'm just not folding almost ever. So of course we're going to go ahead and flat. We pick up top pair in a pretty draw-heavy board. I don't think I'm ever folding to a regular c-bet here, but I'd be more tempted to do so if he made just a normal one. But he goes ahead and again min bets, which I really can't see too much value again in that range. I don't think he does this with the nuts, with the nut flush draw, with the set, 2-pair. I really don't see too much of that, so I expect him to have a lot of kind of weaker stuff like pair and gut shot, or weaker flush draws, or overcards, or just like a naked overpair that he's not really sure what to do with now. So against that range, I think there's definitely value in we can just raise here and barrel him off. But I decided to go ahead and flat on the flop with the intention of getting another bet out of him, hopefully on the turn, and then picking up the aggression there. Unless he did something kind of very strange, like overshove or something weird like that. But on the turn he goes ahead and he min bets again. And now again, as we said before, like it's very hard for me. I don't totally discount his value in this spot, but I think it's a very, very tiny part of his range. If it's even in there at all. So against that, I think rather than shoving here or making a big raise and kind of forcing him to commit to maybe his weaker flush draws or his 7-6 or 9-8, stuff like that, I think kind of a more interesting thing to do here would be to make a small raise, which I think is gonna we're gonna find out really quickly if he has a hand he's willing to commit to, because he's just gonna repop it right over the top. At least that's what I'd expect. And if he just flats us, I think that sets us up pretty well for river aggression and getting him to fold there. Which, if we could draw up a hand as we'd like, having him commit chips on pre-flop, flop, turn, and then fold on the river, that's obviously going to be optimal for us. So I went ahead and made just a small little raise. Now, of course, people are going to be shouting out, hey, what's your perceived range supposed to be here? What are you possibly doing this? And I think that's a very valid point, and against a thinking player, that's going to be, we might not be able to pull off this kind of play. But against a weaker opponent who we expect to be new to the game and just not thinking on the level that we are, I think this is we shouldn't really worry too much about our perceived range unless we have a reason to, and we should just go ahead and kind of make profitable plays and just expect our opponent to be playing his cards more than thinking about ours. So go ahead and make the raise. When he flats again, this just like screams weak draw, weak hand, or some kind of like overpair. The offsuit ace is a decent card for his range. I think he might have been like a two pair hand, like an ace 9 or an ace 7, something like that. Maybe with his flush draw, he just hit top pair, something like that. But I think against all those hands, it's still pretty difficult for him to call off, unless he's just looking to hero call. So when he goes ahead and again for the third time min bets, then it seems to me like he's just trying really hard to get to a weak showdown or to a cheap showdown. So when he does that, although I think I do get heroed by some ace X's some of the time here, I think the most profitable line for us is going to be to just continue our aggression and force him to hero call his ace X or weak 2 pair or anything like that. But I just don't expect that, as I said, to be a big part of his range. So for those reasons, I decided to go ahead and just shove it in and make him hero call. And if he can, that's good for him. And hopefully we'll just get a rematch. So we go ahead and shove, and our opponent, as expected, gives up the hand. Up next, we have just a quick and easy little hand. We are at about 10 big blinds here. Our hand is pretty weak. I don't think shoving here is going to be that profitable unless we're against an extremely nitty opponent. But as we said before, pre-flop, most opponents are quite loose. So I think the higher expectation play here is to just raise and kind of play the hand in a raised pot rather than shove. Our opponent calls, which again is our first signal that he doesn't have a super strong hand here. You'd expect with an effective stack of 10 big blinds to just shove it in here if he did. So when he flats, I really don't give him too much credit for anything. On this board, I think some people would be tempted to check back, thinking they have some kind of showdown value, I guess, and so a little bit of draw equity. But in reality, we don't really have either or very much of either one. So I think checking back here is going to be a pretty big mistake. We're just, for no reason, we're just going to give him the lead in the hand, allow him to put us to the test, when we could just make a standard c-bet, even smaller c-bet if you'd like. You could even make it like a 50 chip c-bet instead of 60. And it's going to suck pretty hard to bet fold here because we're so short, but I think it's definitely going to be preferable to doing anything else. Definitely preferable to checking back. So I just went ahead and made a standard c-bet, and as expected, we get a fold. So up next, we have ace 9, 8, 8 with an effective stack of 12 big blinds. Our opponent goes ahead and limps here, which I think is an extremely weak move. I think our opponents are obviously going to raise or even shove most of their value in this spot. So I think when he does this, I think his range is pretty capped. I think it's going to be made up of a lot of like rundowns, suited connectors, maybe like two-faced cards and some semi-connected side cards. Really, possibly some small pairs. Really not a whole lot of value in here. So I think against that range, our hand is definitely good enough to just jam here and have him fold all his equity, especially being out of position. So that's what I decided to go ahead and do, and I just jam. When he calls, I was a little bit surprised because I don't expect his range to be very strong, as we said. So I kind of treated this as a bit of a frustration or a tilt call because this had been near the end of a couple matches. So he had been getting run over pretty hard, so I expected this to be pretty tilty call. Having said that, this board 764 with 2 diamonds is a board that's going to connect with that kind of range we discussed pretty decently, but I think a lot of the time we're going to see a lot of stuff like draws, like flush draws or straight draws, or pair and straight draw, or kind of like open-enders, possibly some of the time 2 pairs, and maybe even the nuts every now and again. So this is kind of an interesting spot where we have to consider, should we dump our made hand, dump our 8s in favor of taking the 8-9 draw. And I think against if this hand had unfolded differently, and I thought his range consisted of a lot of kind of big pairs and a lot more value than I think this guy has in this spot, then I'd be tempted to just dump our 8-9 and go ahead and kind of gamble a little bit and take the equity I have in the draw and try and run good. But I think against his range that we discussed, I think 8s is going to be ahead a fair amount of the time, and when it's not, I think we're not going to be too far behind. Like, I expect like 2 pairs to be pretty much the top of his range, although he definitely can have a couple of sets in this as well. So whether we dump the 8 in favor of the 8-9 is really going to depend very heavily on obviously the range you put him on, and I think we can just figure out exactly which is going to be more profitable running an equity calculator, but in game we're obviously not going to be doing that. And so I thought with the amount of draws he could have and the general weakness of his range, I thought keeping the made hand, keeping the 8s was going to be the best play here, but it's definitely close. So I just decided to go ahead and keep our 8s, hope for the best. Turns out we were in fact behind, kind of within the range that we discussed, his hand, and but luckily we ran good and beat the turn, which is always nice. So well played by us. Because we ran good. Alright, and finally we have 7763 here, which although it looks semi-pretty, is not really that strong of a hand, especially at a position early in the match, this first hand in the match. So we get opened on. I think there's going to be some value versus certain opponents to kind of 3-bet bluffing here, but I think I was just focusing more on post-flop play and finding really good post-flop opportunities, so I just went ahead and flatted here. This flop's interesting in that we don't really hit it very hard. I mean, we have a pair and a gut shot, which really isn't going to do us too much for kind of any hand that he can continue with. We definitely are not going to have the equity to check call this down. So I think I found this to be an interesting spot where we can kind of rep some stronger hands with check raise. So we can basically just rep the nuts here, which is obviously 7-8. I think for people who are worrying about balance, which we don't necessarily have to do against this guy, as we've spoken about before at these limits, but I think if we're worried about balance, we definitely can be and probably should be check raising our nuts here, just because there's so many bad cards on the turn, both for our own hand as well as for his range that might continue. So he might see a card that he doesn't like and get scared off, or he might have put it in here with like 2 pair or a set versus our nuts. So we don't really want to give him the opportunity to fold later on. So I think that's going to be a good spot to check raise here. But again, we're not worried about balancing so much, so that's not really that relevant. But I think versus the range that he could have here, I think going ahead when he c-bets and going ahead and check raising, I think that's going to present a lot of problems to him, because imagine his spot, even if he had a really strong starting hand like aces or kings or anything like that, it's going to be really difficult for him to continue past the flop. And even if he does get past the flop, turn and river, unless he hits it pretty perfectly, it's going to be just really impossible for him to continue too often. And I think if he does happen to have a really big hand here, like a set, the nuts, 2 pair, I think a lot of our opponents at these limits are just going to stick it in anyways and just hope they're good, not really thinking about our range too much. So my plan here is to check raise, and then if he flats, to basically continue, because I think even if he doesn't doesn't play his really big hand aggressively on the flop, he for sure will on turn, because that just seems to be the standard slow play line, is to slow play one street and then kind of not want to risk going any further with the slow play and just getting it in on the turn. So I go ahead and check raise with the intention of barreling a lot of boards, but we happen to get the fold, so that's nice for us. Alright, so that's going to wrap up our introduction to Irish poker. If you have any questions or comments, please post in the thread. I'm definitely open to being told, hey, you play this hand horribly, here's why. I'm always happy to learn and to improve. Having said that, I hope you enjoyed this video, maybe even picked up a thing or two, and that's going to be it until next time, which should be my Heads Up Hyper Turbo video pack. So keep an eye out for that. For headsupsitandgo.com, this is Sentence 7. Good luck at the tables, and take care.